The cabin of the Gulfstream G650 hissed with a predatory silence as the wheels left the tarmac of JFK, leaving the ruins of Maya's life behind in a blur of gray asphalt and broken promises. She sat across from her new husband, the ivory silk of her wedding gown, a fusion of her own design and forced tradition, feeling like a shroud against her skin. Kenji Shin remained motionless in his matte black wheelchair, his head tilted back, eyes closed as if the mere act of existing were an exhausting labor. The geometric tattoos snaking up his forearms were stark against his pale skin, dark and rigid like the bars of a cage. Maya gripped the velvet armrest, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was a designer who dealt in structure and silhouette, but nothing about this marriage had a shape she recognized. She was a bargaining chip, sold for $10 million and a cleared debt, destined to be the caretaker for a ghost in a suit. "You can stop staring," Kenji said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that didn't match the fragility of his frame. He didn't open his eyes. "The press got their photos. The theater is over for the next 14 hours. "I wasn't staring," Maya lied, her voice tight with a defiance she didn't truly feel. "I was wondering if the monster they described in the tabloids actually has a tongue, or if you just use it to snap at your staff." Kenji's eyes snapped open, dark, piercing, and terrifyingly alert. There was no fog of illness in them, only a cold, calculating hunger. As the fastened seatbelt sign chimed and extinguished at 30,000 feet, the impossible happened. Kenji didn't call for the flight attendant. He didn't struggle. He simply leaned forward, gripped the arms of the wheelchair, and stood up. Maya let out a choked gasp, lunging back against the fuselage as he rose to his full, imposing height. He was not the broken man she had seen on the tarmac. He moved with the fluid, lethal grace of a predator that had been feigning a limp to lure in its prey. He took a step toward her, then another, his presence swallowing the oxygen in the cramped cabin. "They told me you were paralyzed," she whispered, her back hitting the cold glass of a window. "They said the poisoning left you a vegetable." Kenji pinned her against the wall of the jet, his hands bracing on either side of her head. He was close enough for her to scent cedar, bergamot, and the metallic tang of adrenaline. "If the world thinks I'm a threat, they'll finish what they started," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "But if they think I'm a broken toy, they get careless. And when they get careless, they make mistakes." Maya's gaze dropped to his arms. Up close, she saw what she had missed on the ground. The black geometric lines weren't just ink. They were raised slightly above the skin, humming with a faint, microscopic light. "Biotech," he said, noticing her stare. "They're monitors. They track the thallium levels still in my blood and stimulate the nerve endings my loving family tried to kill. Every line you see is a map of my recovery and a record of their betrayal." He leaned in even closer, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw with a touch that was surprisingly warm and dangerously deliberate. "You were brought here to be a distraction, Maya. A pretty American bride to make the board of directors think I've given up on the company and settled for a quiet life. But now you know the truth." His grip on the fuselage tightened, the metal groaning under his strength. "So, we have a new contract. You play the loyal caretaker in public and in private. You help me burn the people who sold us both to this table. If you scream, if you run, or if you tell a soul I can stand, we both die before this plane touches down in Seoul." Maya looked up into the dark abyss of his eyes and saw her own reflection, not a victim, but a weapon being forged. She didn't scream. Instead, she reached up and gripped the lapel of his charcoal blazer, pulling him a fraction closer. "10 million wasn't enough for this," she whispered, her voice finally steady. "If I'm going to be your secret weapon, Kenji, I want more than just my father's debts cleared. I want a seat at the table when the empire falls." A slow, predatory smirk pulled at the corner of Kenji's mouth. For the first time, he didn't look like a ghost or a monster. He looked like a man who had finally found a partner who wasn't afraid of the dark. "Deal," he murmured, his breath ghosting over her lips. As the jet roared through the midnight sky, the paper bride and the crippled billionaire vanished, replaced by two ghosts ready to haunt a dynasty. The scent of white diamonds and desperation always preceded Maya's mother into a room, a cloying floral trail that signaled another looming disaster. Maya stood in the center of her Soho studio, her fingers stained with charcoal, and her heart heavy with the weight of a dream that was rotting on the vine. Around her, the half-finished gowns hung like silk ghosts, their seams pinned with hope she could no longer afford. The rent notice on the door was 3 weeks old, a neon orange scar against the industrial gray paint, and the electricity hummed with a low, dying rattle every time the sewing machines hummed to life. "Baby, we need to talk," Dolores Coleman said, her voice trembling in a way that made Maya's stomach drop into her heels. She didn't look up from the mannequin she was draping. She couldn't. If she looked at her mother's red-rimmed eyes, she would have to acknowledge the cliff they were all standing on. "If this is about Daddy's latest sure thing, Mama, I already told you I'm tapped out," Maya said, her voice sounding hollower than she felt. "The bank won't even let me open the mail anymore." Dolores set her purse down on a cutting table, the heavy thud echoing like a gavel. "It's worse than that. Your father. He signed over the house, Maya, to cover the markers. They're coming for everything. The brownstone, my retirement, your business. They sent men to the house last week. Real men, Maya. Men with guns." The world tilted. Maya's hand stilled on the fabric. The Coleman name had always been a shield, a legacy of black excellence in a city that tried to ignore it. But her father had chipped away at that shield until there was nothing left but dust. $3 million. That was the number Dolores whispered into the stagnant air of the studio, an obscene, impossible sum that might as well have been a billion. "We don't have $3 million, Mama," Maya laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that cracked in the silence. "We might," Dolores replied, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She pulled an envelope from her purse. Thick cream-colored cardstock with a gold-embossed seal that caught the flickering fluorescent light. Beside the elegant English script were the sharp, architectural characters of a language Maya had only seen on luxury storefronts. Shin Global Holdings. Maya's pulse kicked against her ribs. Everyone knew the name. The Shins were the closest thing South Korea had to royalty, a tech and aerospace dynasty that spanned continents. And everyone knew the tragedy of Kenji Shin, the youngest heir, the brilliant architect of their global expansion, who had been silenced by a mysterious accident 2 years ago. The tabloids called him the Ghost of Seoul, a man trapped in a wheelchair, his mind supposedly as shattered as his spine. "They want a bridge, Maya," Dolores rushed on, her words tumbling over one another as she watched her daughter's face. "The Shins need an American alliance to smooth over their next U.S. expansion. They want a woman of substance, someone clean. No scandals. Someone who can stand beside Kenji and make the world believe the dynasty is still strong. They'll pay off the markers. They'll save the house. And they'll invest $10 million into your label." Maya snatched the contract. The legal language was cold, surgical, and utterly dehumanizing. 1 year of marriage, public appearances, absolute discretion. It was a bill of sale disguised as a marriage certificate. There were clauses for every possible infraction, but the one that made her blood run cold was the fine print. Failure to comply meant the immediate foreclosure of every Coleman asset. "This is human trafficking with better stationery," Maya said, her voice shaking as she stared at the gold seal. "It's survival," her mother countered, stepping forward to grip Maya's hands. "You're our only chance. If you don't sign this, your father won't survive the month. These people, they don't take apologies for payment." Maya looked around her studio. The bolts of silk that shimmered like broken promises, the sketches of a future she had worked 16 hours a day for a decade to build. She thought of her father, a man whose pride had outrun his luck, and her mother, who had prayed until her knees were bruised. She was being asked to bury herself in a gilded tomb in a country she didn't know, married to a man who was little more than a mannequin in a chair. She picked up a pen from the cutting table. The weight of it felt like a lead pipe. "I'm not a bargaining chip, Mama," Maya whispered, even as the nib touched the paper. "You're a queen," Dolores said, her voice thick with a relief that felt like a betrayal. "And queens do what is necessary for their kingdom." The ink bled into the cream paper, dark and permanent. Maya signed her name, feeling the ghost of her freedom vanish with every stroke. She didn't look at the terms of the divorce or the clauses on intimacy. She only looked at the name of the man she was now tied to, Kenji Shin. 3 days later, Maya stood on the edge of the private tarmac at JFK. The wedding gown she wore was her own, a masterpiece of structured lace and ivory silk, with a high collar that felt like a chokehold and an afro-textured crown of hair that defied the biting New York wind. She looked regal, expensive, and utterly hollow. A black Rolls-Royce Phantom sat idling near the stairs of a waiting Gulfstream. Two men in suits that cost more than her studio bowed in unison as she approached. They held an umbrella over her, though the sky was a clear, taunting blue. And there he was. Kenji Shin sat in a matte black wheelchair at the base of the jet stairs. He was devastatingly handsome in a way that felt dangerous. His jawline sharp enough to draw blood, his jet black hair swept back from a forehead that looked like it was carved from marble. But his eyes, darker than the deep Atlantic, were fixed on a point somewhere past her shoulder. He looked through her, not at her. His arms, resting limply on the chair's supports, were covered in the geometric tattoos she had seen in the telephoto lens photos, an intricate web of black lines that seemed to pulse against his skin. He didn't speak. He didn't offer a hand. He was a silent, beautiful ruin. Maya took a breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. She didn't look back at the black car that had dropped her off, or the city that had chewed her up and spat her out. She stepped toward the man she had been sold to, her train sweeping across the asphalt like a white flag of surrender. "I'm Maya," she said, her voice a low bell in the quiet of the airfield. Kenji didn't blink. A personal aide stepped forward, bowing to Maya. "The director is ready to depart, Mrs. Shin. We have a long flight to Seoul." As they hoisted the chair into the plane, Maya felt the first true spark of terror. She was no longer Maya Coleman, the designer from Soho. She was a paper bride, an ornament for a fallen prince, flying toward a golden cage on the other side of the world. She climbed the stairs, the lace of her dress catching on the metal, and didn't look back until the door sealed shut with a final, pressurized click. The descent into Incheon International Airport felt like a fall from grace, the gray clouds of South Korea parting to reveal a landscape of glass and steel that hummed with a different kind of power than the one Maya had left behind in New York. As the Gulfstream's tires kissed the tarmac, the pressurized silence of the cabin, the space where Kenji had stood and threatened her life only hours before, shattered. With a mechanical whir, Kenji lowered himself back into the matte black wheelchair, his face instantly smoothing into that mask of hollow indifference. The predator had retreated into the shell of the victim, and the transition was so seamless it made Maya's skin crawl. "Remember," Kenji murmured, his voice barely a breath as the cabin door began to groan open. "You are the devoted wife. You are the shield. If they see through you, they see through me." Maya straightened her spine, the ivory lace of her wedding gown scratching against her collarbone. She didn't respond. She simply stepped out onto the air bridge, the humid soul air hitting her like a physical weight. Below, on the private apron, a sea of black umbrellas and flashing camera lenses awaited them. It wasn't a welcoming party. It was a firing squad. At the center of the phalanx stood Madame Park Sujin, the matriarch of the Shin Empire. She wore a navy hanbok reimagined in modern couture, the silk so stiff it looked like armor. Her hair was pulled into a flawless chignon, and her eyes, as Maya descended the stairs, were two chips of frozen flint. Beside her stood MG, Kenji's younger sister, who gripped a designer clutch like a weapon, her red lipstick the exact shade of a fresh wound. As Maya reached the bottom step, the shutter clicks became a deafening roar. She could hear the muffled shouts of the tabloid reporters held back by security. "Look at her! The American savior!" one shouted in Korean, the translation later echoing in Maya's mind. A designer with a debt, and a prince with a broken back. Beauty and the beast for the digital age. Maya ignored them, keeping her chin level as she came face to face with the woman who had effectively bought her. The silence between them was a vacuum, sucking the heat out of the afternoon sun. Madame Park didn't offer a hand or a bow. She simply catalogued Maya, her gaze flicking over Maya's crown of braids, the deep mahogany of her skin, and the defiant structure of the dress Maya had sewn with her own shaking hands. "You look sturdy, Miss Coleman," Madame Park said in English, her voice as thin and sharp as a paper cut. "A necessary trait for the burden you've agreed to carry." "It's Mrs. Shin now," Maya replied, the words tasting like copper. "And I've carried heavier things than a name." MG let out a sharp, mocking laugh, stepping forward to bridge the gap. She leaned in close to Maya, the scent of expensive lilies cloying and heavy. "Don't get comfortable with the title, darling. In this house, we don't care about your Soho vision. You are a temporary patch on a leaking ship. Try not to embarrass us before the ink on the wire transfer is dry." Behind them, the ground crew lowered Kenji in his chair. The moment his wheels touched the tarmac, the press surged forward, held back only by a line of stone-faced security guards. The mockery intensified. "Director Shin, is the marriage a recovery strategy or a funeral arrangement?" Kenji remained silent, his gaze fixed on the middle distance, playing the part of the shattered heir with a terrifyingly convincing vacancy. Maya felt a surge of white-hot protectiveness that surprised her. She knew he was a liar, she knew he was dangerous, but the sight of these vultures picking at a man they thought was defenseless ignited a fire in her blood. Maya stepped back toward Kenji, placing a firm, steady hand on his shoulder. It was a gesture of public theater, but as her palm touched the fabric of his suit, she felt the rigid tension of his muscles beneath. He was a coiled spring, vibrating with a suppressed rage that matched her own. "The director is tired from the flight," Maya said, her voice projecting with a regal authority that silenced the nearest cluster of reporters. She looked directly into the lens of a prominent news camera, her eyes flashing. "We are here to focus on the future of Shin Global, not to entertain the curiosities of people who mistake silence for weakness." Madame Park's eyebrows arched in a subtle, dangerous ripple of surprise. MJE's sneer faltered. "We are leaving," the matriarch commanded, turning on her heel without waiting for a reply. The walk to the waiting convoy of black Rolls-Royce Phantoms was a gauntlet of flashing lights and whispered insults. Maya kept her hand on Kenji's shoulder the entire way, a silent anchor in the storm. As they reached the lead car, the personal aide, Taman, opened the door, his expression unreadable, but his eyes lingering on Maya with a newfound spark of curiosity. Just before they were shielded by the tinted glass, Maya caught a glimpse of a headline on a nearby tablet being held by a reporter. It featured a side-by-side of her in her wedding finery, and Kenji in his chair, the caption reading, "The $1 trillion sacrifice. Can a Soho outsider heal a broken empire?" Maya slid into the plush leather interior beside Kenji. The door shut with a heavy, pressurized thud, plunging them into a sudden, artificial quiet. The car began to move, gliding away from the tarmac and toward the hills of Gangnam. Kenji didn't turn his head, but his hand reached out, his long fingers grazing the lace of her sleeve before gripping the armrest. "You have a loud voice, Maya," he said, his tone neutral. Yet she could hear the undercurrent of the predator returning. "Be careful. In this family, the loudest person is usually the first one they silence." Maya looked out the window at the glass spears of soul rising in the distance. "They can try," she whispered. "But I didn't come here to be quiet." As the convoy swept through the gates of the massive Shin estate, a fortress of black marble and ancient secrets, Maya realized that the tarmac had just been the opening skirmish. The real war was waiting for her behind the palace doors, and the woman who had bought her was already sharpening the blade. The first night in the Shin estate was an exercise in sensory deprivation. The guest suite was a cavern of obsidian marble and floor-to-ceiling glass, overlooking a garden that felt more like a graveyard for perfectly manicured pines. Maya had stripped off the lace wedding gown, leaving it in a heap like the shed skin of a former life, and replaced it with a simple silk slip. Sleep was an impossibility. The silence of the mansion was too heavy, a pressurized weight that made her ears ring. Driven by a restless, gnawing hunger for answers, she slipped out of her room. Her bare feet were silent on the heated floors as she navigated the labyrinthine corridors. She found herself drawn toward the east wing, where the air grew cooler and smelled faintly of ozone and expensive cedar. She stopped before a set of double doors, slightly ajar, leaking a soft, rhythmic hum and a strobe-like pulse of blue light. She pushed the door open an inch. This wasn't a bedroom. It was a high-tech sanctuary. Kenji was there, stripped to the waist, sitting not in his wheelchair but on the edge of a specialized medical bench. His back was to her, a broad expanse of corded muscle and bronze skin. The geometric tattoos were no longer static ink. In the dim light they were glowing, a deep, rhythmic sapphire. Maya's breath caught in her throat. She watched, mesmerized as the lines shifted. A hexagonal pattern on his shoulder spiraled downward, flowing like liquid mercury toward his elbow, while a series of thin, needle-like lines on his spine pulsed in time with his heartbeat. It was a terrifyingly beautiful dance of biology and circuitry. "You should learn to knock, Maya. Or are you here to finish what my sister started?" Kenji didn't turn around, but the blue light reflecting off the glass walls revealed his eyes, sharp and predatory even in his state of undress. Maya stepped into the room, her fear overridden by the designer's instinct to understand the structure of the impossible. "What is this?" she whispered, reaching out before she could stop herself. "Don't touch them," he snapped, though his voice lacked its usual bite. He turned slightly, allowing her to see his chest. The ink there was a dense cluster of interlocking triangles over his heart. "They're sensitive. Every time my heart rate spikes or my blood chemistry shifts, the nodes readjust. It's a closed-loop neuroprosthetic system. My father's last secret project." Maya moved closer, her eyes tracing the way a line of light bled into his skin. "You said they were monitors, but they're moving. They're alive." "They're sensors," Kenji corrected, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "When the thallium was introduced to my system, it didn't just paralyze me. It began to eat my nervous system from the inside out. This ink acts as a secondary neural network. It filters the toxins and bypasses the damaged nerves. But it's also a warning system." He pointed to a specific cluster of lines on his forearm that were currently flashing a faint, angry red. "Someone in this house put a trace amount of arsenic in the welcome tea tonight. Not enough to kill a man, but enough to trigger a seizure in a crippled heir. The ink detected the spike in my biliary levels before the first symptom could manifest. It's the only reason I'm still sitting upright." The horror of it hit Maya like a physical blow. The coldness of the tarmac, the arctic glares of his mother, the venom in MG's voice. It wasn't just family drama. It was a slow-motion execution. "You're living in a house of assassins," Maya said, her voice trembling. And you're using your own body as a laboratory. I am using what I have to survive until I can find the evidence to destroy them, Kenji said. He stood up, the blue light of the tattoos casting long, monstrous shadows against the walls. He walked toward her, the shifting ink on his legs glowing with every step, a map of fire beneath his skin. He stopped inches from her, his presence overwhelming. They think they're watching a dying man. They don't realize I'm seeing every move they make through the fluctuations in my own blood. He grabbed her hand, pulling it toward his chest. She expected the coldness of a machine, but his skin was burning hot, vibrating with the sheer energy required to keep his body functioning. Under her palm, she felt the hexagonal patterns shift, realigning themselves as her proximity caused his pulse to quicken. "The ink doesn't lie, Maya," he whispered, his eyes locked onto hers. "Right now, it's telling me your heart is racing. It's telling me you're terrified. But it's also telling me you aren't one of them. If you were carrying a toxin, the ink would be screaming black." Maya looked down at where her mahogany skin met the glowing blue of his tattoos. The contrast was striking, a fusion of ancient beauty and terrifying future. She realized then that she wasn't just a paper bride or a shield. She was the only person in this fortress of glass who could touch him without a hidden blade. "If I'm going to be part of this," Maya said, looking up at him with a gaze that refused to flinch, "I need to know how to read them. I need to know when you're in danger before you do." Kenji's grip on her hand tightened, his thumb grazing her knuckles. For a fleeting second, the predatory mask slipped, revealing a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. He was a man holding back a tide of poison with nothing but sheer will and experimental light. "Then stay," he murmured. "Watch the patterns. If the lines over my heart turn gold, it means the system is failing. If they turn black, it's over." As she stood there in the glow of his secrets, Maya realized the shock the world expected wasn't his ability to walk. It was the fact that beneath the tattoos and the billion-dollar empire, Kenji Shin was a man on a countdown. And she, the designer from Soho, was the only one holding the clock. The silence of the Shin estate was not the peaceful quiet of a sanctuary. It was the heavy, airless stillness of a tomb. For 2 weeks, Maya had lived within the black marble walls of the fortress, her life measured in the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the foyer and the soft, clinical hum of the air filtration system. Every morning, she woke to a room that felt larger and colder than the day before. A museum exhibit of a bedroom where even the shadows seemed to be curated. She spent her days sketching at a massive glass desk that overlooked the koi pond, but her eyes rarely stayed on the paper. Instead, she watched the reflections in the glass. The staff moved through the halls like wraiths, exquisitely polite, impeccably dressed, and utterly hollow. Mrs. Kim, the head housekeeper, was a woman of ironed silk and Arctic smiles who appeared in doorways without a sound. Her presence heralded only by the faint scent of starch and mothballs. "Your tea, Mrs. Shin," Mrs. Kim murmured one afternoon, setting a porcelain cup on the edge of Maya's desk. Her eyes didn't settle on Maya's face. They flicked with practiced precision toward the sketches of the smart jewelry line Maya had been tinkering with, then toward the open drawer where Maya kept her private journal. "Thank you, Mrs. Kim," Maya said, her voice sounding loud and abrasive in the oppressive quiet. She waited for the woman to leave, but the housekeeper lingered, adjusting a vase of lilies that didn't need adjusting. "The director's mother is concerned you find the house isolating," Mrs. Kim said, her back turned. "She suggests you spend more time in the sunroom. The acoustics there are much better for conversation." Maya's hand stilled. Acoustics. It was a slip, a tiny crack in the porcelain mask. They weren't just watching her. They were listening. The sunroom was likely a lattice of microphones disguised as crown molding. As the days bled together, the patterns of the espionage became impossible to ignore. Maya began to notice the small things, the way her laptop had been moved by a fraction of an inch while she was at lunch, the way the younger maids whispered in the hallways, their voices cutting off the moment she turned a corner, the way the security guards at the gate checked her bags with a thoroughness that bordered on a search for contraband. She was a prisoner in a gilded cage, and the bars were made of human eyes. Late one evening, the house felt particularly suffocating. Kenji had been gone since dawn, whisked away in a convoy for a series of high-stakes board meetings that Maya was not yet permitted to attend. Seeking air, she wandered toward the library, a vast room of mahogany and leather that smelled of old paper and secrets. As she pushed open the heavy door, she caught a glimpse of movement. A young maid, no older than 20, was standing by Kenji's private safe, her phone held out as if she were taking a photo of the keypad. She froze when she saw Maya, the screen of her phone glowing like a beacon in the dim light. I was just dusting, madam," the girl stammered, her Korean-accented English tripping over her fear. Maya didn't raise her voice. She walked toward the girl, her heels clicking a rhythmic death toll on the hardwood. "With a camera? That's a very modern way to clean. Min-hee." The girl's eyes darted toward the door, looking for an escape, but Maya stepped into her path. "Who are you sending that to? MJE? Or is it the matriarch who wants to know what's behind the steel?" The maid started to cry, a soft, pathetic sound that did nothing to move Maya's heart. In this house, pity was a luxury she couldn't afford. Maya reached out and plucked the phone from the girl's shaking hands. The message thread was open. It wasn't a name at the top, just a string of numbers. The last message sent was a photo of the medical files Maya had seen in Kenji's study days ago. "They told me they would fire my father if I didn't," the girl whispered, sinking to her knees. "They said you were an outsider, that you didn't belong here. They said you were the danger." Maya looked down at the girl and felt a sudden, sharp clarity. To the people in this house, she was a virus, an American interloper who had infected their pure, poisonous bloodline. The staff weren't just servants, they were a nervous system, relaying every heartbeat of the house back to the brain that wanted Kenji dead. She deleted the photos, wiped the message thread, and handed the phone back. "Get out," Maya said, her voice a low, dangerous velvet. "And tell whoever is on the other end of that phone that I'm changing the locks, not on the doors, but on their access to this family." The girl fled, leaving Maya alone in the dark library. She leaned against the mahogany shelves, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wasn't just Kenji's wife. She was his only line of defense. A shadow moved in the corner of the room. Maya gasped, her hand flying to her throat, but it was only Kenji. He was sitting in his wheelchair, shrouded in the darkness of the far alcove. He must have been there the whole time, watching the exchange. The blue glow of his tattoos was dim, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic fatigue. "You handled that with more grace than I would have," he said, his voice a low vibration in the shadows. "I would have had her escorted off the grounds by security." "And then, they would have just sent another one," Maya replied, walking toward him. She knelt beside his chair, her mahogany skin contrasting against the black metal. "Kenji, the entire house is a wire. Every maid, every cook, every driver. Your mother isn't just watching you, she's dissecting us." Kenji looked at her, his dark eyes unreadable. He reached out, his thumb grazing the back of her hand. The biotech ink on his wrist flared a soft, cautious amber. "I know," he whispered. "That's why I brought you here. I needed someone who could see the strings. I've lived in this house so long I've become part of the furniture. I stopped noticing the eyes." He leaned forward, his face inches from hers. "They think you're just a pretty accessory, Maya. They think you're a distraction I bought to comfort me in my final days. Let them keep thinking that. The more they watch you, the less they watch the board." Maya felt the weight of his trust, heavy and sharp as a blade. She looked around the library. at the hidden cameras she now knew were there, at the microphones tucked into the molding, at the silent house that wanted to swallow them whole. "I'm not a distraction, Kenji," she said, her voice a vow. "I'm the storm they didn't see coming on the radar." He smiled then, a real, predatory smile that reached his eyes. "I'm counting on it." As the clock in the foyer struck midnight, the silent house seemed to lean in, listening to their shared breath, unaware that the lamb they had brought inside had finally bared its teeth. The private gym on the sublevel of the Shin estate was a cold sanctuary of brushed steel and reinforced glass, smelling of ozone and the sterile scent of deep tissue liniment. Maya had been led there by a cryptic text from Kenji, an invitation that felt more like a summons. She entered the room wearing simple black leggings and a cropped tank, her hair tied back, only to find the space bathed in a dim ultraviolet light that made the white lines of the basketball court glow like a grid from a futuristic dream. Kenji was not in his chair. He was suspended from the ceiling by a series of high-tension resistance cables, his bare chest glistening with sweat. The biotech tattoos were a frantic, swirling violet, pulsing in synchronization with his heavy, rhythmic breathing. He was upright, his feet touching the floor, but the cables were the only thing keeping the world from collapsing on him. As he saw Maya enter, he signaled to the automated system. The tension in the wires increased, pulling him taut. And then, with a sharp mechanical hiss, the cables released entirely. Maya's heart stopped. She surged forward, her hands outstretched to catch a falling man, but Kenji didn't fall. He staggered, his left leg buckling for a terrifying millisecond before the violet light on his thigh flared into a blinding neon. He caught himself, his muscles corded and shaking, and stood, truly stood on his own power. "Don't move!" he gasped, his voice a jagged edge of pain and triumph. I need to find the center." Maya stood frozen as he took a step. It was a slow, agonizing movement, the mechanical ink beneath his skin working overtime to bridge the gap between his brain and his nerves. He looked like a god being rebuilt from the wreckage of a mortal. He took another step, then another, until he reached the center of the court where Maya stood. He was taller than she had imagined, his shadow looming large and imposing against the ultraviolet glow. "They call this a recovery," he said, his voice dropping to a low rumble as he stopped inches from her. "I call it a war. Every step is a battle won against the people who share my last name." "You shouldn't be doing this alone," Maya whispered, her eyes fixed on the way the violet light traced the hard lines of his abdomen. "The doctors, the system, it's too much strain on your heart." "I have to be ready, Maya. The board meeting is in 3 weeks. If I walk into that room, their coup dies. If I roll in, I'm just a legacy they can vote into a corner." He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he cupped the back of her neck. His skin was feverishly hot, the energy of the biotech system radiating off him in waves. "I needed you to see this. I needed one person in this world to know what I actually am." The air between them, already thin and charged with the hum of the gym's electronics, seemed to vanish. Maya looked up at him, seeing not the ghost of soul or the trillionaire heir, but a man who had fought his way back from the edge of a grave just to stand in front of her. Her hand rose, her palm pressing against his chest, right over the interlocking triangles of ink that guarded his heart. The pattern shifted under her touch, turning a deep, hungry crimson. "You're not a ghost, Kenji," she breathed, her thumb grazing the pulse point at the base of his throat. "You're more alive than anyone in this house." Kenji's grip on her neck tightened, pulling her flush against him. The contrast was a beautiful, violent collision, her soft mahogany curves against his hard, light-scarred angles. He looked down at her lips, his dark eyes clouded with a desperate, forbidden hunger. He had spent 2 years in a cold, lonely vacuum, and Maya was the first spark of heat he had allowed himself to feel. "I shouldn't touch you," he murmured, his forehead leaning against hers. "I'm a man with a target on his back, and I've already put one on yours." "I've had a target on my back since the day I was born," Maya replied, her voice a low, defiant bell. "I'm not afraid of the dark, Kenji. I'm the one who carries the light." The kiss wasn't a gentle thing. It was an explosion, a release of weeks of suppressed terror and silent longing. It tasted of salt and adrenaline and the metallic tang of the biotech system. Kenji pulled her into him with a strength that was terrifying and absolute, his hands tangling in the hair at the nape of her neck as if she were the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. Maya wrapped her arms around his waist, her fingers tracing the glowing ridges of the tattoos on his back. She felt the vibrations of the machinery beneath his skin, the hum of the Project Phoenix sensors trying to recalibrate for the sudden spike in his dopamine and adrenaline. For a moment, the world outside, the spies in the hallways, the mother with the Arctic heart, the father in debt, didn't exist. There was only the heat of his skin and the desperate rhythmic beat of two hearts that refused to be silenced. When he finally pulled back, he was breathing as hard as if he had run a marathon. He leaned his weight against her, his legs finally giving out as the violet light dimmed to a weary lavender. Maya guided him back toward his chair, her movements steady and sure. "The patterns," she whispered, looking at the ink on his chest. "They're turning gold, Kenji. You've reached the limit." He sank into the wheelchair, the predator retreating once more into the shell of the invalid, but his eyes never left hers. He reached out, taking her hand and pressing her knuckles to his lips. The gesture was silent, a vow made in the ultraviolet dark of the gym. "The first dance is over," Kenji said, his voice thick with a promise of things to come. "But the war has just begun." Maya stood over him, the taste of him still lingering on her lips, knowing that they had just crossed a line from which there was no retreat. They were no longer just allies in a corporate game. They were two souls bound by a secret that could either set them free or burn them both to ashes. The dining room was a cathedral of cold opulence, where the scent of white orchids fought a losing battle against the metallic tang of the storm brewing outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. Maya sat at the long ebony table, her posture as rigid as the high-collared black jumpsuit she wore. Across from her, Mji picked at a plate of glass noodles with a silver fork, her movements as sharp and precise as a surgeon's. At the head of the table, Madame Park Sujin sat in a throne of shadows, her silence more deafening than the rolling thunder that echoed over the Han River. Kenji sat beside Maya, his hands resting limply on the armrests of his wheelchair. To the rest of the world, he was a hollowed-out shell, but Maya could feel the heat radiating from his shoulder. A low-frequency vibration that only she knew was the biotech system humming under his skin. Since their kiss in the gym, the air between them had become a live wire, and every shared glance was a coded message in a language the rest of the family couldn't speak. "A toast," Madame Park said, her voice cutting through the clink of silverware. "To the American expansion, and to the bride who has brought such interesting color to our halls." A maid moved forward, not Min-hee, who had vanished after the library incident, but a woman with eyes as flat as pebbles. She poured a vintage golden tea into Kenji's porcelain cup, the liquid shimmering like melted sunlight. She then filled Maya's and the others. Maya reached for her own cup, but her eyes never left Kenji's forearm. Beneath the sheer silk of his sleeve, she saw it. The geometric lines of his tattoos, usually a steady dormant blue, began to ripple. A thin, jagged line near his wrist turned a sickly, bruised purple, pulsing with a rapid, staccato rhythm. It was the pattern Kenji had taught her to fear, the chemical spike. Kenji's hand moved slowly, his fingers inching toward the handle of the cup. He didn't see the ink. He was too busy maintaining the blank, defeated stare he wore for his mother. "Kenji, wait," Maya said, her voice slicing through the polite theater of the room. The table went still. Madame Park's teacup paused midway to her lips. MG looked up, a faint, predatory smirk tugging at the corner of her red mouth. "Is there a problem, Maya?" Madame Park asked, her tone arctic. "Or is our traditional tea not to your New York palate?" Maya didn't answer her. She leaned over and placed her hand firmly over Kenji's. Under her palm, she felt his muscles jerk, the biotech system vibrating with a frantic warning. The purple line on his arm had now turned a deep obsidian black. "The tea is too hot," Maya said, her mind racing for a lie that would hold. "I'm clumsy today. I'd hate for the director to be burned." Before anyone could protest, Maya reached out and deliberately tipped Kenji's cup over. The golden liquid spilled across the white linen, steaming and fragrant. "How clumsy indeed!" MG sneered, her eyes flashing with a sudden sharp anger. "That tea was a gift from the Jeju estates. It's irreplaceable." "I'll pay for the dry cleaning," Maya snapped, her eyes fixed on the maid. The woman had paled, her grip on the silver teapot tightening until her knuckles were white. Maya stood up, pulling a white silk napkin from her lap and dipping it into the spilled tea. She didn't wipe it up. Instead, she brought the soaked fabric to her nose. Then discreetly swiped it across a small, handheld chemical sensor she had hidden in her palm. A device Kenji had given her for design inspiration that was actually tuned to detect heavy metals. The small LED on the device, hidden by her thumb, turned a violent blood red. Aconite. Monkshood. The queen of poisons. In a normal man, it would cause a heart attack within minutes. In Kenji, with his compromised nervous system, it would have been an instant, untraceable failure. Maya looked up and met Kenji's eyes. For a split second, the mask of the invalid slipped. His gaze was a dark, roaring fire of realization and fury. He saw the red light in her hand. He saw the black ink on his own arm. He knew. "I think my wife is right," Kenji said, his voice a low, terrifying growl that made MG flinch. "I am feeling quite warm." Perhaps the tea was oversteeped. Madame Park's expression didn't change, but her fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. "The staff will be disciplined for their lack of care. Mji, see to it." "Of course, mother," Mji whispered, her face now a mask of cold frustration. The dinner was over. The silence that followed was no longer pressurized. It was lethal. Maya walked behind Kenji's chair, her hands gripping the handle so hard her rings bit into her skin. She wheeled him out of the room, through the gauntlet of silent, spying maids, and back into the sanctuary of the East Wing. The moment the heavy doors of his suite clicked shut, Kenji stood up. He didn't wait for the cables or the system. He surged out of the chair, his movement fueled by pure, unadulterated adrenaline. He grabbed Maya's waist and pulled her into him, his forehead crashing against hers. The black ink on his arms was already fading back to blue, the biotech nodes recalibrating now that the threat was removed. "You saw it," he whispered, his breath ragged. "You saw it before I did." "The pattern changed," Maya said, her heart finally beginning to slow. "It turned black, Kenji. Just like you said it would." Kenji pulled back, looking at her with a raw, soul-deep intensity that made her breath hitch. He didn't look at her like a partner or a distraction anymore. He looked at her like she was the only thing standing between him and the abyss. "They're getting desperate," he murmured, his hand coming up to cup her face. "They know I'm getting stronger. They tried to end it tonight, right in front of you." "They underestimated me," Maya said, her voice a low, defiant bell. "They think I'm just here to look pretty in your house. They don't know I've been reading the ink." Kenji leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in a kiss that wasn't about hunger or heat, but about a profound, newfound gravity. It was a seal of trust, a silent admission that he was no longer fighting this war alone. "I didn't think I could trust anyone in this house," he whispered against her mouth. I thought I was going to die in that chair, surrounded by people who shared my blood but wanted my soul. He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her with a strength that was no longer experimental, but certain. You saved my life, Maya. Not just tonight. You saved me from becoming the ghost they wanted me to be. Maya leaned into him, the scent of cedar and bergamot finally feeling like home. She knew that the dinner had been a turning point. She wasn't just a paper bride anymore. She was the sentinel at the gate, the one who could read the secrets written in light upon his skin. The board meeting is in 2 weeks, she said, looking up into his dark, determined eyes. Let's give them something to really toast to. Kenji smiled, and for the first time, it wasn't predatory. It was the smile of a king who had finally found his queen. The morning after the dinner of poisoned tea, the atmosphere in the Shin estate shifted from a pressurized tomb to a theater of war. The silent house was no longer a place where Maya hid. It was a base of operations. Kenji sat in his study, the monitors glowing with the blueprints of Project Phoenix, but his attention was entirely on Maya. He reached into a hidden drawer and pulled out a sleek, translucent tablet, sliding it across the mahogany toward her. MGE has spent 3 years and $40 million trying to perfect the Aura line, Kenji said, his voice a low, resonant rumble. It's a wearable tech collection intended to be the jewel of Shin Global's consumer division, but she's failing. She's designing for the boardrooms of the past, sterile, cold, and unimaginative. She thinks the world wants a gadget. I need them to want an identity. Maya took the tablet, her eyes scanning the mood boards Maji had curated. It was all brushed aluminum and clinical white, devoid of soul or culture. It looked like hospital equipment disguised as jewelry. This isn't a fashion line, Maya said, her designer's intuition flaring. It's a shackle. It tells the wearer they are a patient, not a person. Kenji leaned forward, the blue light of the biotech ink on his neck pulsing with a sudden, sharp clarity. Exactly. I want you to take over as creative director, effective immediately. I've leveraged my remaining voting shares to bypass the committee. I'm giving you full autonomy, Maya. No vetoes, no interference from my mother, and certainly none from MGE. You're putting a target on my chest, Maya said, looking up from the screen. MJE will see this as a direct declaration of war. It is, Kenji replied, his eyes dark and unwavering. By putting you in the room, I'm forcing them to look at you while I move in the shadows. But more than that, I need your vision. The world needs to see the fusion of what we are, the strength of your heritage and the precision of my father's tech. We aren't just selling jewelry. We're selling the same survival that's written on my skin. By noon, Maya was standing in the high-altitude glass palace of the Shin Global Design Studio, 40 floors above the bustling streets of Gangnam. The air was thick with the scent of expensive espresso and the palpable hostility of 20 senior designers who had been told their new boss was an American outsider with no corporate pedigree. MJE was already there, standing in the center of the room like a blood-red splash against the monochrome decor. She held a prototype of a smart bracelet, her knuckles white. This is an insult, MG hissed as Maya approached. You've been in this country for less than a month, and you think you can walk in and dictate the aesthetic of a trillion-dollar legacy? You're a seamstress, Maya, not a visionary. Maya didn't flinch. She walked past MG to the central drafting table, clearing away the clinical mood boards with a single decisive sweep of her arm. She reached into her bag and pulled out a series of sketches she had worked on during the long, sleepless nights in the mansion, patterns inspired by African mudcloth, bold geometric shapes from Ndebele art, and the intricate fluid lines of Korean traditional calligraphy. The era of the invisible gadget is over, Maya said, her voice carrying a regal weight that silenced the room. We are going to create something that people wear because it makes them feel powerful. We're using recycled gold, ethically sourced lab diamonds, and we're going to integrate the sensors into the patterns themselves. We aren't hiding the tech. We're making it the art. She looked directly at MG, whose face was a mask of livid disbelief. Your line was about monitoring the heart. My line is about making the heart beat faster. If you want to stay and help, find a seat. If you want to complain, find the exit. The director has given me the floor, and I intend to use it. The shadow war had moved from the hallways of the mansion to the heart of the empire. For the next 10 days, Maya became a whirlwind of creative fury. She slept in the studio, her mahogany skin illuminated by the glow of 3D printers and holographic renders. She pushed the engineers to their limits, demanding that the biometric sensors be etched into the gold as if they were ancient symbols. Kenji visited her every night. He would roll in his chair, playing the part for the cameras in the hallways, but once the doors to her private studio were locked, he would stand. He became her muse and her strategist, his own biotech ink providing the data she needed to perfect the Phoenix bracelets. They worked in a feverish electric bubble, their bodies often brushing over the drafting table, the heat between them a constant, distracting hum. "They're terrified," Kenji whispered one night, standing behind her as she adjusted a render of a necklace that glowed with a soft, protective amber. MJE tried to call an emergency board session to freeze the funding. She claimed you were diluting the brand. My father blocked her. He wants to see if the American can actually fly. "I'm not just flying, Kenji," Maya said, turning in his arms. "I'm setting the sky on fire." Kenji's hand slid to her waist, his thumbs tracing the line of her ribs. The violet light of his tattoos was steady and strong, a testament to the progress they had made together. If this launch succeeds at the gala, MG's influence over the consumer division is dead. She won't have a platform left to challenge my return. And if it fails? It won't, Kenji said, his voice dropping to a low, possessive growl. He leaned in, his lips hovering an inch from hers. Because for the first time in my life, I'm not just fighting for a company. I'm fighting for the woman who saw the king inside the ghost. The kiss was a seal of their alliance, a dark, desperate promise made in the heart of the enemy's tower. Maya knew that MG was already planning her counterstrike, a smear campaign, a betrayal, or something worse. But as she looked at the glowing gold prototypes on the table, she felt no fear. She had spent her life being told she didn't belong in the rooms of power. Now, she was the one building the room. The shadow war was reaching its tipping point, and when the light finally hit her designs at the gala, the world wouldn't just see a billion-dollar brand, they would see the moment the paper bride became the empress. The grand ballroom of the Shin Grand Hotel was a cavern of shimmering glass and predatory intent, smelling of expensive lilies and the cold, metallic scent of impending betrayal. Maya stood at the edge of the mezzanine, her silhouette a regal defiance against the sea of black-tie vultures below. She wore a gown of her own creation, iridescent silk that shifted from deep mahogany to molten gold, mimicking the rhythm of a heartbeat. Around her neck was the Phoenix Alpha, the masterpiece of the Aura line. It pulsed with a soft, protective amber light, its lab-grown diamonds hiding the microsensors that were currently recording the frantic pulse of the room. Beside her, Kenji sat in his matte black chair, his face a mask of hollowed-out porcelain. To the 300 investors and media moguls below, he was a tragic ornament. To Maya, he was a coiled spring. She could feel the heat radiating from his legs. She knew the biotech system was pushed to its absolute limit, the ink beneath his suit trousers likely a blinding, agonizing violet. "It's time," Kenji whispered, his voice a low vibration that only she could hear. They descended the glass elevator like gods being lowered into a pit. The moment the doors opened, MG stepped into their path, flanked by two stone-faced board members. She held a tablet aloft like a sacrificial blade, Her red lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Stop the music," MG commanded, her voice amplified by the ballroom's sound system. The orchestra fell silent, the air turning thick with the scent of a kill. "Before we celebrate this creative director's vision, perhaps the board should see where the funding actually went." She flicked her finger, and the massive holographic screens that were meant to display Maya's designs suddenly shifted. Grainy bank statements and forged wire transfers splashed across the room, documents showing millions of dollars flowing from Shin Global into Maya's struggling Soho studio. "Embezzlement," MG announced to the gasping crowd. "Our paper bride didn't come here to save the empire. She came to strip it bare. She's been using my brother's condition to sign off on her own theft." Maya felt the eyes of the world turn into needles. Madame Park Sujin watched from the VIP dais, her expression one of Arctic satisfaction. Security guards began to move toward the stage, their hands hovering near their belts. "Maya, do you have anything to say?" MG sneered, stepping closer. "Or should we just call the authorities now and end this farce?" Maya didn't look at MG. She looked at Kenji. This was the moment of the great filter. If he stayed in the chair, she was going to prison. If he stood, the world they knew would end. "I have nothing to say," Maya said, her voice steady and echoing through the hushed hall. "But my husband does." A ripple of mocking laughter started at the back of the room, but it died instantly. Kenji Shin placed his hands on the armrests of the wheelchair. The sound of the mechanical locks disengaging was like a gunshot in the silence. Slowly, with a terrifying, agonizing grace, he rose. The shock was a physical wave. Glassware shattered as a waiter dropped a tray. Madame Park stood so quickly her chair toppled over. MG stumbled back, her tablet clattering to the marble floor. Kenji didn't just stand, he dominated. He stood a head taller than the guards, his presence a dark, roaring fire. He reached out and grabbed the microphone from a stunned announcer. "The only theft in this room," Kenji's voice boomed, deeper and more lethal than anyone remembered, "is the 3 years of my life stolen by the people who put thallium in my tea." He walked toward MG, every step a thunderclap of impossible reality. As he moved, he unbuttoned his charcoal blazer and shoved his sleeves up. The biotech tattoos were no longer blue. They were a brilliant, triumphant gold, pulsing with the power that was fueling his nerves. "My wife didn't embezzle a single one," Kenji said, stopping inches from his trembling sister. "She spent the last month building the technology that is currently streaming a live feed of your private server to the Seoul Metropolitan Police. Every forged document, every offshore account you created in her name, it's all being decrypted in real time." He turned to the audience, his hand finding Maya's. He pulled her to his side, his grip iron-strong and protective. "Maya Coleman didn't marry a ghost," he declared, his eyes locking onto his mother's pale face. "She married a king who was waiting for a reason to wake up. The aura line isn't just jewelry. It's the proof that the Shin dynasty is no longer run by cowards and assassins." The ballroom erupted. It wasn't applause. It was a riot of flashing cameras and shouting voices. The shock had landed with the force of an earthquake. Security, realizing the shift in power, turned their backs on Maya and formed a protective ring around her and Kenji instead. MJE collapsed into a chair, her face a mask of ruin as the police entered the foyer. Madame Park Sujin simply sat back down, her eyes fixed on her son as if seeing him for the first time, or perhaps the last. Kenji ignored them all. He leaned down, his forehead resting against Maya's in the center of the chaos, the gold light of his ink reflected in her eyes, a shimmering bridge between two worlds. "You cleared my name," she whispered, her heart finally finding its rhythm. "You gave me a name worth clearing," he replied, his voice thick with a raw, undeniable heat. The grand reveal was over. The invalid was gone, and the paper bride had been crowned in the fire of the climax. As the cameras flashed, Recording the moment for history, Kenji didn't look at the empire he had reclaimed. He only looked at the woman who had taught him how to walk through the dark. The aftermath of the gala felt like the quiet after a nuclear winter. The black marble halls of the Shin estate, once filled with the stifling presence of spies and the arctic scent of Madame Park's perfume, were now hollow and echoing. MG was gone, her reputation dissolved into a series of criminal indictments that had dominated the news cycle for 72 hours. Madame Park had retreated to a distant villa in Jeju, a silent exile agreed upon to avoid a total collapse of the family's stock. The fortress was finally empty, save for the two people who had set it on fire. Maya stood on the rooftop terrace, the same place where she had once felt like a bargaining chip waiting to be spent. The Seoul skyline glittered beneath her, a tapestry of neon and glass that no longer felt like a cage. She was dressed in a simple silk wrap, her hair loose, the Phoenix Alpha necklace resting on the stone railing beside her. Its amber light was dim, a resting heartbeat for a system that was no longer in combat mode. The soft hum of the elevator announced his arrival. Maya didn't turn around. She listened to the rhythmic sound of footsteps, steady, deliberate, and remarkably human. There was no mechanical whir, no drag of a heavy chair. Kenji walked to the railing and stood beside her, his presence a warm, solid weight in the cool night air. He wore a simple white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal tattoos that had settled into a soft, dormant indigo. "The board approved the global rollout of the Aura line this afternoon," Kenji said, his voice a low, melodic vibration. "They've officially rebranded it as the Maya Collection. The orders from New York and Paris have already exceeded the 5-year projection." Maya smiled, but it was a tired, bitter-sweet curve of her lips. "I heard. My mother called 3 times. Apparently, the Soho studio is being featured in Vogue. She's already picking out a new brownstone." "Is that what you want?" Kenji asked, turning to face her. The predator was gone, replaced by a man whose intensity was now focused entirely on the woman standing in front of him. "To go back to the life they tried to take from you?" Maya looked at the city, then at the man who had become her world in the span of a few heartbeat-driven weeks. "I wanted my freedom, Kenji. I wanted to pay the debt and walk away with my head high. I wanted to prove I wasn't just a paper bride." "You did that," Kenji murmured. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper, the original 20-page marriage contract, thick and embossed with the gold seal of the Shin family. Without a word, he produced a silver lighter. He flicked the flame, the orange glow dancing in his dark eyes, and touched it to the corner of the document. They watched in silence as the legal ease, the clauses on intimacy, and the terms of their strategic alliance curled into black ash, drifting over the railing into the Seoul wind. "The contract is gone, Maya," he said, the ashes vanishing into the dark. "You don't owe me a year. You don't owe the Shin family your presence. The wire transfer to your label is permanent. You are free to walk out of those gates tonight and never look back." Maya felt a sudden sharp ache in her chest. Freedom was what she had prayed for. But as she looked at Kenji, she realized that freedom without him felt like a different kind of exile. "Is that what you want?" she whispered, her voice a low bell in the quiet. "For me to leave?" Kenji stepped closer, the space between them vanishing until she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. He reached out, his long fingers grazing her jawline before sliding into the hair at the nape of her neck. His touch was no longer clinical or desperate. It was possessive and profoundly tender. "I spent 3 years in a desert of my own making," Kenji said, his voice dropping to a raw, soul-deep confession. "I thought I was dead until you walked onto that tarmac in a dress that looked like a challenge. You didn't just give me my legs back, Maya. You gave me a reason to stay standing." He reached into his pocket again, but this time he didn't pull out a contract. He held a small velvet box. When he opened it, there was no tech, no sensors, and no biometrics. It was a simple, flawless black diamond set in a band of hand-carved gold, designed with the same geometric precision Maya had brought to the aura line. "I'm not offering you a merger this time," Kenji whispered, his forehead leaning against hers. "I'm offering you a life. I want to build an empire that actually deserves you. I want to wake up in a house that isn't silent. I want to be the man who earns the right to stand beside you, not the director who bought your time." Maya looked down at the ring, then up into the dark abyss of his eyes. She saw the king, the monster, and the man, and she loved all of them. She reached up, her fingers tracing the indigo lines on his neck, feeling the steady, rhythmic pulse of a heart that was finally beating for something other than survival. "I didn't come here to be a distraction, Kenji," she said, her voice a vow that echoed the one she had made in the library. "And I'm not leaving until we've finished what we started." She took the ring from the box and handed it to him. Kenji's hand shook slightly as he slid the gold band onto her finger, a permanent weight that felt lighter than any shackle. "So," Maya murmured, her lips inches from his, "what happens next?" Kenji pulled her into him, his arms a fortress of warmth and strength. The tattoos on his skin flared a soft, radiant gold, a final signal of a system in perfect harmony. "Next," he whispered just before his mouth found hers, "we stop fighting the war, and we start living the victory." As the sun began to peek over the Han River, painting the sky in shades of violet and mahogany, the paper bride and the crippled billionaire were no more. In their place stood a king and a queen of a new dynasty, walking together into a future that was no longer written in a contract, but in the light upon their skin and the truth in their hearts. The shock was over, but the story had only just begun.